Black Myth Wukong just dropped a benchmark tool a week ahead of the release of the game, which is great news for us because now we can see, is this game going to be playable on our handheld devices? Today I'm going to test it out on the ROG Ally X, and you know the drill. We're going to go through all the settings and we're going to see just how well this game is going to play on this device. Without any further delay, let's jump in and set up the settings. To start things off, display, I'm going to keep it at 1080p and no frame cap, VSync off, motion blur, might as well turn that off. Super resolution, increased super resolution can improve image clarity in certain situations, but will significantly reduce performance. Adjust with caution. So it's at 66 right now, FSR is on, and frame generation is on. Ray tracing is off, and we're at low settings. We're also at the 25 watt turbo power mode, 1080p, 120 hertz. Here we go. Other than going down to like 720p, this is basically gonna be best case scenario. We're utilizing all of the frame generation possibilities here, and it's looking pretty good. 60 plus frames per second. There's a few hiccups there every once in a while where it's just glitching out before it can catch back up. It's really trying to stay above 60 frames per second. I don't feel like this is the best case scenario because there's not a lot going on. They do have some light in the water, so there's some reflections and whatnot, but they're only putting about 1 or 2 characters on the screen, and there isn't any intensive, graphical things happening, which it looks like during some battles it can get pretty heavy. And those stutters, they just keep coming. Like right there, it just happened again. That's something that I hope we won't see so consistently like we just did in this first test. I'm also curious to see if maybe we dump down to 720p, if that will help it out and we won't be getting those stutters. But the fact that this is playing at above 60 frames per second at 1080p, again, utilizing FSR and frame generation, this is giving it its best shot. I'm hoping I can try AFMF 2 and we'll get our own little reading here of how well the Ally X could perform. Other than all those stutters that just keep consistently happening throughout this is super promising. It looks phenomenal. It's staying above 60 frames per second. Yeah, that's not bad. Getting a 62 average, 47 frames per second is what they're saying is the minimum. But again, we were experiencing pretty consistent dips there where it was just freezing and then going again. But now let's jump back in, change the settings to medium and see what we can get. We're going to keep all these the same. We're just going to change graphic presets to medium. All right, here we are. Now it's going into the mid 50s, where at low settings, we were consistently staying above 60 frames per second. This is legitimately almost a 10 frames per second drop. Still very impressive that we're at 1080p, above 50 frames per second in this brand new title. Still experiencing those stutters, which I am not very stoked about. Right here, it's dropping into the high 40 frames per second. But to put this into perspective, if we can play this game at 1080p with FSR on and stay above 45 frames per second, the graphics on this game are truly next gen, and it's utilizing Unreal Engine 5. So this is a good case study for what the future of gaming should be like. And compared to like Hellblade 2, this seems to be performing pretty well optimized. This is their benchmark, so I'm assuming that they optimized this to its best potential before releasing it, because why would they want to release a benchmark that does not showcase the best case scenario? And I wonder if the game is going to be, representative in this test. But if it's anything like this, I'm happy. This is absolutely going to be playable, which is great news for all of us with handheld devices. I'm really curious to see how this is going to perform on the Steam Deck, because this device is definitely utilizing the frame generation and all of that, which the processing power of this device was created with that in mind. It has the power to do the AI generative stuff. I wonder what it's gonna do on the Steam Deck. All right, so we got 50 frames per second and the lows just stayed above 30. So you could definitely play this game 1080p, medium settings. That's good to see. Now we're gonna go from medium to high. With how well it just did on medium, I'm almost wondering if this is gonna maybe get us a 30 frames per second playable version. And here we go, 1080p, high settings, and it's showcasing us a solid 40 to 45 frames per second as it begins. But I think once we cross past this bridge underlay, that's where we might start getting a little more intensive on the graphics. I'm also interested to see what the lows are gonna be, because even at medium, we were just above 30 frames per second, where now I have a good feeling that our lows might dip below 30 frames per second. But again, this is incredible to see that we are at 1080p and experiencing a brand new game on a handheld device, and it's showing us a pretty solid above 30 frames per second and often going into the 40 frames per second. It'll be interesting to see how well optimized they launch this game day one. Notoriously, a lot of these games, like Cyberpunk, had horrible launches, and that makes it extremely difficult for these smaller handheld PCs and people with lower end PCs. But if this test is showing us anything, it might be that this studio has actually done an incredible job of making sure that their game is very well optimized, which would be incredible. They're a newer studio to a giant AAA game like this, so they do have a lot of pressure on them to make sure that they're going to deliver on what they promise, and this could literally be like a game changer for their studio. All right, getting an average of 40 frames per second at high, that's really impressive, because you could absolutely go into the settings and just dump down some of the things like light and reflections to a little bit lower than high, and then the lows that are at 26 could get bumped up to above 30 frames per second. And you could lock this in at 30 and enjoy mostly high settings at a constant 30 1080p on a handheld device. So good to see. All right, now we're gonna get crazy and go to very high 1080p. I'm not feeling incredibly optimistic about this, but what if there's a chance that this stays at about a 30 frames per second? I don't know. We're gonna find out right now. It does seem to be consistently dropping about 10 frames per second every time we go up, and the last one was 40 frames per second. So maybe at very high, we could be experiencing 30 frames per second. Mind you, that is with FSR and frame generation, so it's trying to fill in the gap of like 15 frames per second, which it's doing right now, and it's not even 30 frames per second, and it honestly looks so much better than so many things that get frame generation. So I don't know why this is doing such a good job. At such a low frame rate, it still looks pretty good. At 22 frames per second, this should look just like absolute. I think it's actually playing slow. It's not even playing at full speed, which is helping it look a little bit better. But I'm really impressed with the FSR and frame generation right now, because, I mean, this means the game is natively playing at like 11 frames per second, and it's trying to just fill in the gaps, and it doesn't look terrible. I'm not saying this is playable. You would definitely not play it at these settings, but I'm just curious why their frame gen and FSR is looking so good. Right there, the tree is flipping out. That makes more sense. But that was kind of the worst part about it, which is interesting. I am confused why this looks so good with this FSR and frame gen on. I'm not seeing like a lot of ghosting. I'm not seeing a lot of, mushiness and the trees are kind of the only, telling thing right now that something funky is going on. I mean, I didn't have my hopes up that we would be playing 1080p very high settings, but I also wasn't anticipating that we would even be getting anything close to this at very high 1080p. We haven't even started our test at 720p. So getting a solid 23 frames per second, lows of 20, definitely not playable. This is at very high settings, 1080p on a handheld. Very impressive. All right, so from very high, they have a next one that's called cinematic. Now, I don't know if that's just they're going to add depth of field and different camera angles, or if this is their equivalent to Ultra. So we're going to try this as well and see if there's much of a difference. It does seem like it's getting a little less performance at the low 20s now, where I feel like we were getting almost 25, 26, 27. Now this is very stuttery. So this is absolutely a higher settings, and it is taxing on the device for sure. We are definitely not going to be playing in cinematic mode on our handheld devices. But again, pretty impressive that we're even seeing, you know, a pretty decent moving image. I'm not gonna get my hopes up, but I am interested to see when we go down to 720p what this is gonna be able to do, even at this cinematic mode. And this is, again, this is at like resolution set to 66, so we could even go down to like 50%. There we go, 21 frames per second, 17 lows. Impressive, but obviously this is not like a playable situation going on right here. Okay, now we're gonna change the resolution to 720p and test this out. Okay, now we're gonna test them all out at 720p. I'm gonna turn VSync on because this is a VSync monitor, and I'm wondering if that will help with some of the jittering that we were experiencing. Motion blur is off, 720p, and we're gonna start things off nice and easy at low settings. And it's looking awesome with all of those things on. I don't anticipate people would be playing on a handheld with these off. Now, how much super resolution you use, that's something that, you know, we'll tweak. But this is just a benchmark, and I'm curious to see what this is gonna look like in the real game. 720, 120, 25 watt turbo. All right, here we go. So this is going to be our absolute best case scenario. I doubt anyone's gonna wanna play this game at under 720p while utilizing the resolution scaler, FSR, and frame generation. Now we're dancing into the 70 frames per second. I do believe that we were experiencing a solid above 60 frames per second at 1080p, so it does seem a little difficult to want to go all the way down to 720p just so that we can be getting, you know, 5 to 7 more frames per second. That is, unless we experience significantly less of the stutters. But again, we're still seeing these stutters happening at these lower settings. And I'm curious why that's the case when it's telling us that we are getting this nice of frames per second and the lows are pretty high. It just feels like it's really struggling to get a smooth shot through this whole take. It almost feels at 720 than it did at the other. It almost feels less smooth than it did at 1080p, which is interesting. And it almost makes me want to go back in and turn off VSync because I added a variable that we didn't have last time. But this is showing us a consistently high 60s into the 70 frames per second. I'm interested to see what the low frames per second is gonna say at the end of the benchmark, but it still looks really good, which is very impressive. All right, we have a solid 69 frames per second, and the lows are 48 frames per second. I'm gonna turn VSync back off just to keep it so it's more similar to the last test that we did. And then we'll go into settings. So now we're gonna bump up 1 to medium settings. This feels like it might be the settings that a lot of us will use, or something similar, where we're using, you know, 720p, maybe upscaling it, and at around medium settings. And within those medium settings, you could probably tweak some stuff to improve the performance or to improve the looks. But this is already feeling a lot better. I'm wondering if VSync was causing issues in conjunction with FSR and frame gen, because now we're not getting that like, whoa, motion stopping and going throughout the whole entire take. All of a sudden we're experiencing 70 frames per second, high 70s, mid 70s, and it's looking way smoother. 80 frames per second. I'm actually so confused right now. Why going from low and then jumping up to medium settings, the only thing I did was I turned off VSync. So VSync was definitely causing issues on that last test. So I'm gonna go back and do low again with VSync off, because this is playing way smoother and at a higher frame rate, and we're at medium settings, 720p. Like, if this is what the game is gonna be like, medium and a mix maybe of medium high is gonna definitely be the way to go. 76 frames per second, 59 lows. Okay, we're gonna have to go back and do low settings again, because that VSync really was messing some things up. All right, here we go. 720p, low settings, FSR is on, frame gen is on, and we are looking at over 100 frames per second on this device. Man, it's like hard to believe that this is the reality. It's like, did they just create some fake little benchmark that they threw out a week before the game just to hype us all up and show us that on our handheld devices even, that we could experience over 90 frames per second, and that it actually looks this good? Even at these settings, the game is looking phenomenal, which is, again, they just did such a good job of implementing this, at least in this benchmark. But again, I just can't help but to be a little bit skeptical and just believe that this is obviously their best foot forward. Why in the world would they release something just to test the benchmarking if they didn't optimize it to the absolute best case scenario? And is that going to translate to the entirety of the game that they've created? And I guess we're gonna find out next week. This is running better than a lot of games that came out 5+ years ago. And the graphics are amazing in this game. So whatever they did to be so diligent to ensure that they were very well optimized, at least again in this benchmark, shows the dedication of a team of people who really know their craft, and hopefully can set the stage for all game development companies, that the answer is not, go buy the newest, biggest, best graphics card, but the real solution is incredibly well-written code that can run proficient. An average of 102 frames per second. Lows of 72. This is awesome to see. All right, now we're gonna jump up to high settings, 720p. See what happens. We're still at that 25 watt high settings, really trying to stay at that 60 frames per second, but it doesn't seem like it's gonna be able to withstand it. It's just dipping below in the high 50 frames per second, but it definitely looks better. Compared to low, going to high is looking phenomenal. And this is definitely playable. We are almost at a locked 60 frames per second. You could even frame limit yourself to like 45 frames per second and play this at high settings. Just good to see. Dip down to about 50 frames per second, but again, we're almost always above the 50 frames per second. It just did dip into like 48, 49, but then it jumped all the way back up to 59. Could you imagine if they dropped this a week before the game comes out? Everybody gets super stoked that they're going to be able to play this device on their lower end PCs, and then they get the real game and it just is garbage. Like, can't even play at all. Nothing like this. Like, this is a totally separate entity that they just built on the side just to, trick people. I don't think that's the case. But could you imagine? That would be a bad move. Which is why I kind of think that maybe this is going to be a little bit of an example of what the game is going to be like. There it is. An average of 57 frames per second, lows of 46. All right, now we're going from high to very high. So far, it's been playing really great at 720p, even at high. So I almost think we are going to get a playable version at very high. It's really wanting to stay above 30 frames per second right here in the beginning. Can it stay above? And right there, it dipped right below 30 frames per second just for a moment and then jumped back up to almost the mid 30s. Even at very high settings, and we haven't even tweaked anything at all. Not to mention, we could take the scale resolution and bump it down to like 50 as opposed to what it's set at 66, and maybe help this out if you really wanted to. But now it has dumped all the way to the mid 20s, making it seem improbable that we would want to play this game at very high settings. You could probably take some of the settings and bump them down to medium or high, and then get a locked in 30 frames per second, even on this device. It looks incredible, and it's handling it no problem on a brand new Unreal Engine 5 title. It's good to see. So I think we hit the limit. I don't think we're gonna be seeing, any usable case study of playing this game at very high settings, even though it is getting very close to being able to handle it. Once you have to start dumping down the resolution and scaling everything lower, it just starts to lose all of the good looks that you gain from going to very high. And it was actually playing pretty well at high settings. So I don't think this is going to be something that anyone is going to be doing. You just stick at high or medium. The average was 28. We had minimums of 22. So yeah, not playable, but again, impressive. Now I want to see how this will run at the 17 watt performance mode. Still at 720p, 120 hertz, but we'll jump back in and go to low settings. I feel like this is actually going to perform pretty well at low settings, just because of how amazing it did at 25 watts. And for a lot of games, you don't notice a massive difference from the 17 watt to the 25 watt performance mode. Every once in a while, it will help you get to that 60 frames per second, but when we're already getting 100 frames per second or more, I think that's when you can probably just go down to the 17 watt, save your battery, and look at this. We're getting over 90 frames per second, almost that whole intro, and now it's going to the low 80s, but still incredibly impressive. Having a handheld device with an 80 watt hour battery that can play a brand new AAA title that looks like this at the 17 watt performance mode is a game changer, I would say. This is phenomenal to see. Really staying strong at that 90 frames per second area, making this a great option for on-the-go play, which is crazy to say that you could take this and consider it an on-the-go game to play. It looks incredible. My gosh, I love this. This is so good to see. I can't wait for next week when we get the real game and we can really start seeing what it's gonna actually be like. 93 frames per second, 72 minimums, 110 maximum. That was great. If we could get this kind of performance, we don't need anything else. It's so good to see. All right, we're gonna use Super Resolution. We're gonna take the 720p and upscale it to 1080p. We're using AMD Fluid Motion Frames 2. High performance and anti-lag. We can see that it's working because the frame gen lag is showing at a 17 millisecond, which is not so bad. Jump in here, make sure that FSR is off and that we have no scaling going on because we're already doing that. Low settings, performance mode. This is turbo, 25 watt, AFMF 2, 720 being upscaled to 1080p. Yeah, this is looking incredibly smooth. We're not getting the 100 frames per second that we were seeing with the built-in FSR. It's pretty impressive to see that this game is playing well over 30 frames per second natively, but then while using frame generation technology, we're able to boost it into the high 70s and 80 frames per second. All right, so this isn't going to tell us what the frames per second we're experiencing with AFMF 2, but basically you can double these numbers. So it's almost 40. We were almost getting 80 frames per second, but to see the minimums hitting 12 is a little lackluster. It would have been nice to see those at minimum of 15 frames per second. More would be much better. All right, first impressions. I'm very impressed with the built-in FSR and tools that they have to make this game playable on a handheld device like the ROG Ally X. If there's anything else that I should test out before the game comes out next week, let me know. Maybe I could do a quick little update and try out a few different settings. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, and hit that thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one.